Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and with me tonight is Father Steven Bigham. How are we doing, Father?
Hi, everybody. How you doing? I'm fine.
It's good to have you on. It's amazing having read your stuff for a few years that we get to actually talk. We get to go into some details in your work, and tonight's going to be a really interesting show because you have a very controversial thesis defending. It shouldn't be controversial, at least in the church, but among academics, defending the integrity of Saint Epiphanius and alleging that the anti-iconic works, the iconoclastic things that are imputed to him, are in fact forgeries. And so, Father, I just want to ask you this before we get into the prepared questions. I mean, how has the reception been to this thesis of yours?
Well, I suppose it's been the same as for all of them. Some people like it, some people don't. I haven't seen any smoke burning up in the sky from people who are trying to attack me. But you know, academic work is kind of off in an isolated place and doesn't get down too much to the lower level. So I don't actually know. I don't imagine I changed a lot of people's opinions, but that's okay. I'm here to defend a point of view. That's I think the Orthodox point of view on the legitimacy of Christian art and icons. And
It's
he's a big block that we have to deal with because of these documents attributed to him.
Now it's this is a topic that fascinates me because as a faithful Orthodox Christian, we obviously want to see our saints vindicated. We want to see them vindicated by the evidence. We don't want heresies imputed to them like iconoclasm. And however, with my Orthodox hat off, my historian hat on, I have to say, while I am very sympathetic to the arguments you make and arguments that others make about anti Nicene iconodulia and anti Nicene Christian art, I do find some of the arguments made about Saint Epiphanius more tenuous and more difficult. So this will be a critical interview where you're going to be given the opportunity to make the strongest possible case that these are in fact forgeries, that there's no saints in the history of the church that taught against iconodulia, because the case of Saint Epiphanius is fascinating because he's so explicit in the text ascribed to him. Just so the viewers are aware, Father Stephen's going to argue that they are forgeries, that they're not rightly ascribed to Saint Epiphanius. But they're so explicitly against iconodulia, he could have not been more explicit.
No,
It's
it couldn't have.
it's uncannily explicit,
Isn't
and
isn't that
so
strange? Isn't that strange how in those documents he sounds just like an iconoclast of the eighth century. Isn't that amazing? How he was what a prophet he was.
it's I think the most fascinating thing is in the Seventh Ecumenical Council in Nicaea II. It actually the topic comes up, if I remember right, in the sixth session of the council, and in criticizing the iconoclast and Hira for citing Saint Epiphanius on the issue of iconodulia, they actually reference saying they are so foolish, these iconoclasts. They quote in their forgery, the forgery says that the vast preponderance of the doctors and bishops of the church were iconodules. They said this
Yeah.
shows they have no sense. So it's one of those incredible things where people will cite Saint Epiphanius as proof against iconodulia. And the first time this was posed to the church as a reference against iconodulia, they scoffed at this. Like, what kind of ridiculous argument is this? Because the evidence, quote unquote, evidence you're posing literally proves our case. It makes no sense that you would be using this evidence. So that's why it's so fascinating. But there's a lot of different texts ascribed from St. Epiphanius. And I want to take the time tonight to go over them, go over some details. If people don't know the details, how could people read your article, I think it's a section of the book. Well, it's actually a short book. It's on Smashwords, right? How could people read your thesis on Saint Epiphanius? Um, that book that you have.
How can they read it?
Yes, how can they find it?
All they have to go put into Google Smash Words. That's the ebook platform, and put in my name, and they're all free, unless people want to pay. But otherwise, they're free. You just download them, and there it is.
I believe it's Epiphanius, Doctor of Iconoclasm question
Oh,
mark.
yes. Here, this isn't the actual book, but it's a copy of it.
There you go.
Epiphanius.
See, I appreciate, Father, that you not only make your stuff available for free, you pirate your own book and you copy it.
Well,
So
yeah, that's isn't that a wonderful thing about electronic stuff? You know.
it shows that it's for the love of the game, right? Of the
Yeah,
research of the
yeah.
fathers.
There
It's
you
for the
go.
love of it. It's not just about the money. But
Oh
you
no,
guys could
Lord,
leave.
no,
But
no,
you
no.
could leave a tip for Father Stephen on Smashwords. So the link is below. Please check it out. This is details not in the book. We're going to be hashing stuff even beyond the book. So if you want nitty gritty, please check out the book below and show some love to Father Stephen.
Yeah.
Now, now let me jump into this. I'm going to quote you, and I'm going to want maybe you to hash this out a little bit. You say that nearly all scholars of modern times have judged that these iconophobic documents attributed to Saint Epiphanius to be authentic.
Yes.
Now, reading your own research, it shows that at least with certain scholars, you go between Ostrogosky and some other guys, that other than the letter to St. John II of Jerusalem, that most scholars think the other works are authentic, but there seems to be a little more doubt. So, do you mind hashing out what scholars think is absolutely authentic and where there's a little less certainty?
Well, it all depends on where you are. One English scholar, it's very good that an English scholar mentioned this, and he analyzed all the people's things, and he said it does seem a little bit strange that all the German scholars, being Protestant, they are for authenticity, and all the Orthodox, the Greeks and the Russians, they're against it. And Catholics usually come down, either they don't know or they're on the side of the Orthodox. And he said, "Isn't that strange that nationality has such a strong role to play in deciding whether these documents are authentic or not?" So it's not true to say that absolutely all scholars agree that they are authentic. That is not true. But probably most of them do accept the authenticity of them. And I think I would. This is me, of course, talking. Uh, I think that's the easier route. Imagine, because if you say they're all authentic and off we go and everybody agrees, and so you go on to something else. But if you say, like I do, that they are either misinterpreted or they've been doctored somehow, or they're totally made up, then that person, in this case me, I have to go and build up a whole big case. And most people, it's not worth it. To me, it's it's I'm batting for the home team. I'm defending something that is not just a scholarly question, but is part of our faith. It's questioning the very authenticity of the entire tradition. And yeah, I go out there and defend that. So it's for me, I'm much more engaged in the question, and so I'm willing to say, take on the Goliaths of the scholarly world, and make a case for my case. And I think it's not that big of a deal. Most scholars don't want to rock the boat, or so they just, okay, so they're authentic, so let's move on. But I do say, and I make that point later on. It's very strange that scholars, art historians, and other scholars have not taken. I mean, if all these documents are authentic, it's very it's very strange that scholars have not taken that positive information about the 4th century and incorporated that in all of the the patristic books and the art history books and all that stuff. But none of that hasn't been done at all.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you bring up. And just so people are aware, you do a straw poll of scholars that particularly deal the textual critical question: are these works from Saint Epiphanius on the issue of iconoclasm, are they authentic? And they're all going to go, yeah, they probably are. But then it otherwise has no bearing in their analysis of the history of the question, because they don't seem to take them very seriously otherwise,
No,
right?
no.
You don't get, for example, Robin Jensen going to the history of 4th century Christian art, and here you have very specific descriptions of how the art was used, what it looked like, from St. Epiphanius, but it never bears mention. It's almost as if people are aware this. I'm not so sure about this, that we want to be citing this. So that is a very interesting point that you do make.
I would say this too. If the documents are true, there was some kind of controversy over icons in the 4th century, because Epiphanius, well, the true or the false one, says that he spoke to the bishops of his time, and he wrote to the emperor, and he ends up saying that very few people listened to him. But if let's go back to that time. How many bishops were there? I would just take a guess. Let's say there were 500 Orthodox bishops in the world at the time, and he said, well, a very few of those, even if it was 5%. 5% of 500 is 50 bishops. That's a pretty large group of people, and you would think that there would be that some of the other great doctors of the time, Chrysostom and all the other Basil, somebody would have written something about this icon controversy that is in the documents, supposedly. But what do you get? Zero, silence. There are no in the history books, no doctoral theses. There's silence about this so-called first if you say first, then iconoclasm and Protestantism, the first iconoclastic controversy. Nobody says anything about it, which kind of raises a little bit of doubt. Come on, guys, if these are all true, these are all authentic, you should be incorporating this positive information. This will be like a discovery of a new something new in archaeology, that all the people would take it into account in their future studies. But nobody's done that, which makes me think, there's something fishy going on here, that people aren't really willing to stake their scholarly reputations on something that it might not be authentic, and then they're really in a problem.
Now, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but it does address the point you just made. People will often cite, well, Saint Epiphanius is against icons, and this means that you have saints and you've betrayed the teaching of your own saints, etc., etc. But Saint Epiphanius wrote to Saint Theodosius, who wasn't against icons. He wrote to Saint John II in Jerusalem, who wasn't against icons. So even within this corpus ascribed to Saint Epiphanius, he's outnumbered by contemporary saints that are actually his opposition. So my question to you would be this with St. John II, because this is one of the letters where I feel that even you concede, at least in the Greek, this is likely an authentic postscript to that letter, at least a good probability. Mm-hmm. The question is, do we have any extant response from John II?
No, no,
And
we don't.
so, and so I point this out is when studying a lot of these questions, certainly the point that you make is worthy of serious consideration because Saint Epiphanius theoretically did not have a one-off with just John II. He supposedly got in arguments with everyone in the world, pretty much, including the Roman emperor, and you think someone would have said something back. But one thing that does,
Do you know that he died out of communion with John Chrysostom?
yes, over the whole issue of Theophilus of Alexandria, and
Some issue, but he broke communion with John Chrysostom. I mean, that's the guy's a little bit, and that's not, nobody questions that. That's real. That's real history. He died out of communion with John Chrysostom. If you can figure that out.
and this actually leads me to my point, which is I do think with Saint Epiphanius, we see this in text. We see this, for example, even way later in history, like when the Lutheran theologians of Toboggan, however you pronounce it, wrote to Jeremiah II of Constantinople, that oftentimes when you're posed with something so ridiculous or so offensive, or you don't know how to deal with something, let's say it really is written by St. Epiphanius, and he's a bishop and he's traveling all around and causing a ruckus in several different ways. Sometimes the best thing is to say nothing. And that does actually happen when you read the history and in the primary sources. Is oftentimes, like, for example, St. Gregory the Great got into a very drawn out argument over the term ecumenical patriarch. And we actually have, I don't know, at least a dozen letters of his where he emphatically complains about it. And yet, I think we only have one letter which even mentions he got a response from anyone about it. And it was from the Patriarch of Alexandria at that time, where he called him ecumenical pope, and then he said, "You can't call me ecumenical pope because that means you're not a pope of Alexandria anymore," and et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But I pose this as an example that it is possible when there's a saint like Saint Gregory the Great that sometimes gets behind something so emphatically, and in some respects for a kind of crazy reason, because, like, again, the whole ecumenical patriarch thing's really not a debate for anyone's communion anymore, that sometimes people respectfully treat it with silence. You don't get that anymore with the internet. Like, us moderns, like, always, like, it's Fox News. They're yelling back at each other. But, like, in ancient times, they would actually sometimes, out of respect, pass things over with silence. And
Well,
and with St. Gregory the Great, we got more than a dozen letters, which we see that exactly at play. So, but that doesn't mean that is the case. It's an interesting point you bring up. I bring up that counterpoint so people could kind of get that full spectrum of
okay.
evidence.
What my response to that would be, the question of ecumenical patriarch is, even at the time, was relatively insignificant. Uh, Even many other questions which were much more important were debated. Now, what did the so-called Epiphanius say? Now, he dropped an atomic bomb, which nobody can remain silent in the face of his accusation. What did he say? He said that the old time idolatry, you know, Old Testament Baal and all, Baal, old time idolatry has been reintroduced into the church. That's the accusation, according to the text, that's attributed to him. So that anything else that he said before that has really no importance. When you make that kind of accusation to the emperor, to the great doctors of the church at that time, well, wait a minute. I mean, maybe he's cuckoo, but you can't just let that go. You can't just let that kind of an accusation that idolatry, the old time idolatry, has been reintroduced into the church because of Christian images, icons. You have to make somebody's got to say something. Hmm? But what? No, silence. No, nobody said anything, and so that's what we have to deal with. We have to deal with that atomic bomb accusation. I
Well,
mean, what's worse for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, I guess, yeah, than idolatry? I mean,
and
that's the
at that time, there still were idols, and there still were destroying the pagan idols. Like that
but
was
not
that
in
was
the
still a thing,
church, not
but
in
not in
the
the
church.
church. Exactly.
Oh,
So it's
he
a good point.
says,
It wouldn't be like theoretical at that time. It would have been a very concrete claim.
no, that's right.
They
Yeah.
were
He's
dealing with
not saying,
idolatry. It's
well,
a good
maybe
point.
this, that, but where he says where there are, and he says they're all over, where there are Christian images, that is idolatry. Whoa.
Now, in a general way, and then we're going to start getting into some details. You pose an interesting thesis, which I also want to get to a little more detail, where Saint Nicephorus calls the writer saying, "I've seen a bishop with the original manuscripts, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a different writer named Epiphanius, right? And it's one Greek letter that makes it different from Epiphanius.
yeah.
A little different in English, but in Greek it's just one different letter." And so one thing we have to consider when discussing this is, well, what if these were authentic works of a nobody bishop, of someone just really not that important that were preserved?
Mhm.
Because the strongest argument made in favor of the authenticity of these works is they don't have there's certain hallmarks they have that aren't typical of forgeries. For example, the Greek is very similar to people writing at the time. It's very simple, like Saint Epiphanius's own Greek is. You get into some textual critical things, which we'll get into the interview, but the Greek fits the era. That's one thing that's worth pointing out. The second thing is
Fits which era?
the fourth century.
Okay.
And the second thing that comes out is that the scholars are like, for a forger, this person seems really personally invested and with personal details. And some of these personal details seem so personal, a forger wouldn't add them. So, like, usually in a forgery, you don't make a fool of the person you're lionizing as your evidence. And there's certain things that kind of make the writer sound kind of foolish,
Mhm.
which would be a hallmark of authenticity. And so, a lot of this begs the question whether or not were these falsely ascribed to Saint Epiphanius, but they rightly belong to a contemporary of his with a very similar name, and we at least have some textual basis for this. Whether it's super convincing, people could debate, but I just want, as we now start unpacking the pros and cons of its fourth century attestations and whether it's Epiphanius or not, I want that to keep in the back of their heads. Some of that. So if you're game, Father, I want to read something you quoted in summarizing St. John of Damascus' skepticism of these works ascribed to St. Epiphanius, and I have some follow-up questions if you're ready.
Yeah, sure.
So this is quoting Father Stephen here. Now, St. John of Damascus, to sum him up, has these reasons for being skeptical that the works ascribed to St. Epiphanius are really his. Now, the fact that St. John of Damascus is writing in the early 8th century about it gives us good reason to believe that at least they existed at that time, obviously, but no one else ever wrote or mentioned them before then. So they might be, theoretically speaking, might not have even existed until shortly before him. But the point is,
We're in the same situation as with Eusebius of Caesarea. All of these documents that are attributed to Epiphanius, they are absolutely absent from the historical record until the time of iconoclasm. Isn't that Doesn't that kind of set off some bells and whistles? They only come to light, historical light, in the iconoclastic period. And St. John is witness to he was about 750 something, in there. And he says that they already were circulating, but nobody says anything about them before that time. So that it's a little bit fishy again, like Eusebius of Caesarea.
it's fishy. The timing's very convenient. It's not altogether impossible. Very rarely in the fathers, like with Saint Athenagoras, for example, certain works really, like, even though we think they're really from the 2nd century, Saint Athenagoras, they come out in the 9th century. So it's not impossible, but it is something that's very suspicious. With St. John of Damascus, he gives the following reasons, quoting you, Father. It says, 1, probably basing himself in part on the life of St. Epiphanius, Chapter 132. St. John claims that the disciples of St. Epiphanius decorated the churches of Cyprus with images, even as Epiphanius' own church. So this, so people aware, this is cited also by Nicaea too as evidence that these must be forgeries because his own church had icons in them.
Mhm.
And before people dismiss this as ridiculous, that's actually a basic archaeological claim. It shows the
Yes.
ancients weren't stupid. We're looking at archaeology here, and it kind of points that he's not. So that is something worth considering. Number two, St. John accuses the iconoclast of having falsified an authentic work of St. Epiphanius or simply invented the will. There's something called the will of St. Epiphanius, by the
Yeah.
way. It has a negative reference to religious images. According to St. John, such forgeries were very common at the time. 3. St. John admits that if the will is authentic, it should not be interpreted as a prohibition or a refusal in principle of Christian images, but rather as a disciplinary measure intended to correct an abuse. Just so people are aware, that's a very similar apologetic often said with the Council of Elvira. Like it's something, well, it says what it says, but you're taking it the wrong way. It's meant to address something local. So this is
Yeah.
something St. John considers.
In this debate, it's very important to distinguish between a disciplinary canon, one that sees something that's going wrong in the church and says you should not do that, and then, but it's just an abuse of some kind. Maybe things were going on in the cemeteries with images that I mean that's perfectly possible, and that he wanted to be make a statement against that practice. That's one thing. The other part is a statement of theological content that says ultimately, because that's the atomic bomb argument that he makes, that icons are idolatry, and as we'll talk about for Elvira, the Council of Elvira, it's very important. Is it a disciplinary canon which doesn't touch on the theology of the icons, or is it, as iconoclasts and iconophobes would want to say, it's a theological thing? That's another point we'll discuss, and you just brought that up, a very very good point for St. John too.
Now, on that point, St. John continues, and even if and this is again, this is quoting this is actually summary from you fathers even if the will is authentic and St. Epiphanius did in fact forbid images in churches to correct an abuse and not to eliminate idols, his opinion in and of itself cannot change the tradition of the church. St. John concludes that St. Epiphanius did not say that Christian images are idols. Now, having read all those different things,
the real Saint Epiphanius,
I'm sorry?
The real Saint Epiphanius.
Yeah.
Not
so now I do want to pose this. St. John just gave several different explanations, some even seemingly allowing for it being authentic, but just saying, well, if it's authentic, it doesn't apply the way you think it does, or it doesn't, one piece of evidence in isolation doesn't prove that everything else, that the rest of the church tradition is wrong on the question. So my question to you is, does this reflect that St. John was under the impression that the will was probably true in some respect? Why do you think he gave it such credence to actually consider all those different angles?
Well, each person studies a question and comes up with his own or her own answers to the thing. He obviously he wanted to defend the iconophile stream of Christianity, and so he had to admit maybe it was true. But again, and this I have done also. Okay, we can admit that it is authentic. It maybe is authentic, but it doesn't mean what the iconoclasts and iconophobes say it means. It goes close to, but doesn't actually touch the theological question. So St. John wasn't sure. He was in Damascus. That's a long way from where St. Epiphanius was. He had no ways to check it out, but Some people were saying it's an authentic thing. And he says, well, if it is, we can interpret it in a way that does not support uh, uh, iconoclasm. And so that's what he says, and leaves it at that.
Well, let me ask you this: does the fact that Saint John doesn't mention any other works other than the will suggest they do not exist? He doesn't even mention the postscript.
Well, uh, there you go. I mean, we have 5 documents. Some one or two are just a sentence long. So you would think that if there were other documents circulating at the time, and he was aware of at least that those two, he would have spoken against the other ones that were in circulation as well. Now you can say, well, he didn't know about the other ones. Okay, you can say that, but somebody as important as Saint John of Damascus, the fact that he doesn't even mention them, doesn't know about them, at least helps, at least increases the possibility that they were invented or discovered, after him, and were brought up at the council, the Iconoclastic Council of Hieria. I think, again, it's not a solid proof, but it's a piece of evidence that tends to weigh in favor of the inauthentic nature of these documents.
Now, let's talk about Nicaea II's treatment of Saint Epiphanius in response to the Council of Hieron. Now, Nicaea II makes a very interesting argument. It argues that the Panarion, which some people are aware, that's like the greatest hit of Saint. That's his Hotel California for Saint Epiphanius. He never mentions icons as a heresy in a book against literally all the heresies, right? The Panarion. So why wouldn't he, if he acknowledges their white? So why wouldn't he, right? He literally says they exist in the whole church. The Panarion is an absolutely huge book. It's like 1,000 pages translated, which I'm sure Father Stephen's looking for on his bookshelf.
Yeah, I'm looking for it.
Why would this not bear mention once? I mean, you think idolatry is pretty big deal.
Well, I think that's a very solid. I was trying to find the actual translation. It's a big, thick book. That's a very, very good point. That why somebody who's so very big on heresies? Yeah, he was a heresy hunter, which is good for us because we have his book and he tells us about a lot of things. But he said he does not say in his Panarion that making Christian images is a heresy, and saying that they were idols. Well, I mean, how? Again, there's that atomic bomb attack. If you're going to say that, you certainly would think that somebody who's looking for heresies everywhere would put that in his book, but he didn't. He didn't. There is, for the historical and authentic Epiphanius, there is no heresy of Christian icons, and that seems, for Nicaea and a lot of us, that seems like that's a good point.
Now, like we were already discussing, Nicaea II likewise makes the point out of where these things come out of nowhere that we're talking about them. So it's the council was aware of this as well, but they also make an interesting argument. They argue that the contemporaries of Saint Epiphanius did not view the creation of images as idols, and it actually literally quotes a passage from the letter to Theodosius as proof. Now, is this a tacit acceptance that they considered it possible that Epiphanius wrote what he did, but his witness is outnumbered by other saints? Because they were willing to actually cite some of what he wrote because they saw that it actually demonstrated the existence of iconodulia.
Well, don't forget, there are two. I have to go anyway. There are two letters to Theodosius, the emperor. One is authentic, and we have it in other documents. He really did write a letter to the Emperor Theodosius. This other one, which is highly contested, that one we don't think was is authentic. So the fact that they quote what they quote is his real letter, and they contrast that with the other letter that is supposed to be from him, to show that in fact they're incompatible. Theodosius was known for fighting heresies too. He was known for decorating, and he was very pro decorations. And interesting point in the letter, let's call it the inauthentic one, or the one claimed to be inauthentic. He tells the emperor, there's all kinds of images in the churches, even mosaics. And of course, mosaics are not something that, it takes a long time to make them, and they're very expensive. And so, but he says that there are already mosaics in the churches, and that more are being planned. But you, oh great and holy and righteous emperor, you know what to do. You will stop them, and you will take them out, get them out, get the idols, out of the churches. But then he says, well, but there may be some mosaics up too far up high that you can't get to, so just leave those, but don't make any more. Now, what does that say? He's already identified Christian images as idols, and he wants to get rid of them in the churches, and tells the emperor to do that. But he says, well, if some of the idols up on the top there you can't get to them, well, leave them there. I mean, what he's saying is that leave the idols up on the high parts, but get rid of the idols down below. I mean, does that make much sense? You'd almost want to dynamite the place if it's a house of idols. There's the inconsistency in, and that's one of the things that many scholars in Nicaea too have noted, just the inconsistencies. If all of this is true, he actually accused the emperor of being an idolater, because he knew that Theodosius has approved those things, and we know too that he didn't do anything to get rid of them. So he's complicit. The emperor is complicit in this act of in idolatry, because he's not going to get rid of them. And the implication of Epiphanius's accusation is that anybody who is complicit in these images and stuff, they're also idolaters. Whoa. I mean, you're calling the emperor an idolater? Ooh, that's a little...
I hear that's bad for your health. People wake up dead when they do stuff like that.
Yeah. Maybe it's a bit mafiosoic, but I don't know. You got...
Well, I tend to think that ancient empires worked very, very similar to the mafia.
But not like the modern ones. Not like the modern ones, though.
Oh, well, yeah, the Russian mobs ruined everything.
Oh, yeah. We only talk about that.
I missed the good old-fashioned mafia.
Yeah,
so that being, I appreciate you pointing that out. There's two different letters that they do. I was just thinking of just one. Let me ask you about Saint Nicephorus, his treatment of the topic, because he actually puts the most detail and thought, and perhaps because more of these forgeries, as you allege, come out in time by the time he is patriarch in the early 9th century. So, according to Nicephorus, he makes the most interesting argument. He says, the iconophobic documents that carry the name of Epiphanius are forgeries because they contain ascetic and Manichaean ideas, which are not those of Epiphanius. So let me ask you this, because the audiences these days dig up all this philosophical stuff. What specific ideas? What in these documents is ascetic and Manichaean? And being that Saint Epiphanius wrote against these heresies in the Panarion, how are they unreconcilable?
One of the questions that scholars debate is there a similarity in style, vocabulary, a way of writing, all that stuff? Stylistic similarities between the two groups the Panarion and these other so-called authentic documents. And Nicephorus says, well, listen, let's not get bogged down in style. Epiphanius wrote in a very colloquial style. He was kind of a country bumpkin type. He wasn't very well educated, and well, apparently his Greek was somewhat a little bit higher than the New Testament. That's his Koine Greek, which is in the way classical scholars view Plato and Aristotle, and oh my goodness, the New Testament is like way down there in quality. He says, don't do the style business. That's not the way you're going to show really whether these are the same by the same man. Go by the doctrines. Go by what each set of documents says. It proclaims. Now, one of the things is the word incomprehensible. Incomprehensible is a classic theological term, which, in talking about God is incomprehensible. He cannot be understood. We can't get our minds around him. He's incomprehensible. Now, that word is a negative beginning with in, as opposed to comprehensible. God is incomprehensible. And indeed, Epiphanius uses that word in the Panarion when he talks about the Trinity. And he uses it several times to talk about God in his divine nature and Christ in his divine nature. He always uses it in reference to the divinity, never in reference to the incarnation. That's very clear, very clear. Now, what do we read in one of these documents? We hear him say, we hear the so-called Epiphanius say, but how is it possible for us to paint the image of the incomprehensible Christ? He uses the word that the real Epiphanius only used for the Trinity, God's divine nature, Christ's divine nature, not in reference to his humanity. But in the documents, the so-called Epiphanius uses the word incomprehensible, but in reference to the incarnation, which says that, well, if he was incomprehensible in his human nature, how could he be incomprehensible in his human nature? Well, that's a little bit what the Docetics said. He was only man in appearance. A human being cannot be incomprehensible. Only God is incomprehensible. So man must be comprehensible. But he never says that in these documents. He does say it in the real documents attributed, that are really from Epiphanius. So Saint Nicephorus says, now look, don't take the fact that you have the same word in both groups of documents. What you have to do is dive in and see how that word is used. And when you do that, you see that it's very clear. The Epiphanius is orthodox, straight on, okay, no problem in the Panarion, but he's very theologically deficient in the supposed documents, because he does not say, he applies the word incomprehensible to Christ in the incarnation. And that's the basic point of view of Nicephorus in his attack. That don't look at style. Style is, anybody with a brain could have imitated the style of Epiphanius. He's really kind of a country bumpkin. So don't go that way. Go to the direction of seeing the differences in theology between the two groups of documents, and that's the point I take. And I think in going through the various steps, you can very easily show that they don't have the same doctrine.
Now, how about Nicephorus points out claims that the works deny the real Saint Epiphanius doctrine, the saints being alive in heaven, and while the iconoclastic writings kind of imply they're dead. Do you think some of these are kind of stretches that they're making a logical extrapolation, saying, well, because he denies images, he's denying that the saints are alive? Or do you think these parallels are found, or actually these disjunctures are explicit in the works?
I mean, we can all be critical of everybody. Everybody's critical of everybody. You can't say you say X, Y, Z, and somebody says no, it's A, B, C. Okay, great. Nicephorus made his comments, made his arguments. I personally, when I went through them all, I sort of like you. I mean, you felt, gee, that one's not so weighty. That doesn't seem to be very. Okay, so I put a list of the ones that I personally think aren't very. They're not very weighty. They may be true, but they're not really convincing arguments, such as the one I just mentioned about incomprehensible and applied to the incarnation.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
do you think this is a weighty argument?
That one that you mentioned, okay, he said it, but
Well,
there are many.
how much weight do you put behind his claim that if these works were authentic, that they belong to Epiphanides?
Epiphanides. Epiphanides. That's
How you say it?
Epiphanides. Epiphanides. Well, maybe,
He said he saw it.
well, okay. Maybe he did. Maybe he did. I put that one in the category of, well, okay, maybe it's true, but
I'm gonna
the weight
push
of the
back a
argument
little
doesn't
bit,
hang on that.
and I'm gonna say if there is strong elements and strong evidences that these aren't forgeries, but that would make no sense coming from Saint Epiphanius, then you have to consider, well, maybe there's something there with that.
Well,
Maybe. So
that's
it's something we got to think about. Well, how about
yeah.
this next one?
Okay.
And this is an egregious one. Why why does the authentic works of the at least the life of Saint Epiphanius, the hagiography, ascribes him being a Jew? Right? This would have been no random detail, right? Like they didn't really like Jews that much. So it would have been no random detail say this saint is a Jew, right?
Mhm.
But within the iconophobic works, and I think it's the letter to Theodosius, he says that he was reared in the Nicene faith, like he grew up a Gentile Christian and not a Jewish convert.
And
Why,
his parents too. And his
if this is
parents
a
too.
forgery, why would they make such an egregious error like that?
Because you know, if Epiphanius was a Jew, is that going to get them very far? Is that going to be a big arguing point for the iconoclast? No, but if to reinforce the authority of Epiphanius, if you say that he was a Nicene fighter, he grew up in the Nicene faith, and his parents were born in the Nicene, and he comes from, his lineage is pure, really Nicene. Isn't that great? Wow, that increases his authority, huh? There's only one little problem. When when was when do we think he was born? Maybe
Somewhat before Nicaea, right? Don't
a
they think he's
little
very
bit,
old?
like about let's say he was born 305 to 310. Nicaea is 325, and he says he was born into and raised in the Nicene faith. Wait a minute. And his parents too. Well, that kicks it back a whole generation. That's back into probably 290 something, 280, 290 something like that. I mean, it's way before. It's way before Nicaea. So wait a minute. You say you were born and raised in a faith that hadn't yet been defined? Wait a minute. that's really stupid.
So were the forgers simply really stupid, or is this a honest detail of someone with a very similar name just talking about his background, or perhaps some sort of pious exaggeration?
Well, I think it certainly is, because I go with the life of Epiphanius, that he was in fact Jewish. I think that was a an effort on the part of the iconoclast to do. I mean, they're forging anyway, so a little more isn't going to be a big deal. Uh, so give him the purest lineage, theological family lineage. Put him right in there with the Nicene faith, except that
They should have made him 7 feet tall, blonde hair, and blue eyes, right?
well, I mean, let's not over. Even if you're a forger, you don't want to overdo it. That's the problem.
Because that's why that sort of detail it borders on overdoing it. See, like these are the sort of things that scholars look at and go like, it actually looks authentic because it's not a mistake someone would make out of other than complete abject stupidity,
Yeah.
which is possible. There are really stupid people. There's no doubt about that. But the forgers would have been part of likely a court circle. Like they would have been
You
working
would think.
for, you know what I mean? Like you think they've been a little more tactful, Um, they definitely should ask their money back from those forgery people. So
What I did was, I mean, this is a very clear difference between the two groups, the two bodies of literature. In the life, well, there's about 9 chapters, I think, several beginning of the life, several chapters where it talks about his Jewish origins, and very detailed, and you wouldn't make that stuff up so detailed, if you didn't have a real source, either Epiphanius himself or someone who knew his life, uh, and put that into his life. And then the documents here say he was of pure Nicene theological family background. Now, those very different. So I went through, and all the scholars, most everybody says, well, that life is the life of Saint Epiphanius. You can't take that; it's too full of fantastic stuff, and so they throw it out. Give no credence to it whatsoever. Nicephorus, however, Patriarch Nicephorus, he took the whole thing as 100% true, and he drew attention to the fact of the differences between the two bodies of literature. But let's eliminate both of those extremes, rejecting everything in it and accepting everything in it. There are problems. And even in the Greek books, that Minya, there's what's called a monitum. The fellow the editor says, well, this story has some problems with it, but what you should do is use your critical thinking and go through and pick out the good stuff and leave the bad stuff. And da, 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 da. Well, no, but that's precisely what most scholars do not do. They simply throw it out because there are problems, and therefore nothing in it is of any good. So they take the opposite. They take they take the idea that Epiphanius was in the Nicene family there. But I say, look, let's analyze all of this, and I go through. This is not the time to do that, but I go through, and analyze.
In your support, I would say that most scholars actually agree he really is Jewish, right? Like if you read any basic scholarly treatment of Saint Epiphanius, they treat that as historical fact, which
that's not
which
true.
at least concedes the main point of disjuncture between these two sources is that
not everybody doesn't do that. I mean, even I can't think of his name right now. The patristic text, the big book there. They say, well, he was born in Eleutheropolis, and then jump to Egypt. They jump over his life. They don't say anything about it because they don't They don't believe it. And that's another example of, if this is true, how come we don't see that in the Patristic Digest, where various authors talk about the text and all. They skip over. They either say he was of Nicene background, or they skip over that. Which is a sign that, ooh, how come you're not putting what is supposedly good historical facts? You're not putting that into your digest, into your big thick books on all the patristic fathers. So I wouldn't say everybody does accept his Jewishness.
Now
What
let
I
me
Yeah.
let me ask you this, and just so people are aware, Saint Epiphanius is also in the Saints of the Desert Fathers, and I think if you triangulate the people he's talking with, it would have been like in the mid fourth century, and so for him to be reared like as a child in the Nicene faith and been 20 years old and already been having people following him in the Egyptian desert would be pretty unlikely. He would have been too young to be an authority in a monastic context like that. But all that aside, there's a very interesting thing you bring up in your book, which is that St. Nicephorus is comfortable speculating that some of these passages are authentic and they belong to Eusebius of Caesarea. What's the deal with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, because Eusebius has a reputation not only of being iconophobic, but also of being sort of an Arian. He's not a good. He has a bad reputation that way, as being Arian. He supported a form of Arianism at his time. So, and what does
So,
Arianism? Yes.
and so it seems that Nicephorus is thinking these works are probably from the fourth century. We're not, it might be Epiphanides, it might be Eusebius. It belongs to some heretic from the fourth century. So it sounds like he thinks they have some ancient pedigree.
Well, again, he if they are authentic, or if they're not authentic, whether they are or aren't, they show this tendency of Docetism, like as I mentioned before, with incomprehensible in the incarnation. So, and Saint Nicephorus says, well, look, he's just a new Eusebius. I'm not quite sure. I have to go back and look at that. I'm not quite sure Eusebius Nicephorus believes that particular part to be authentic or not, but he's simply saying, look, we know what Eusebius of Caesarea said. He was sort of an Arian, and this is basically the same kind of stuff. So this Epiphanides is a new Epiphanius, a new Eusebius. I don't think he's
I
saying.
see. So he's kind of equating the two.
He's equating the two. I don't think he's saying that there's a real link historically between the two. He's just saying, well, we have a new I don't know who could we say.
Well,
We have a new somebody.
let me ask a cool question. Nicephorus, he points out that in the letter to Theodosius, the icon makers
Again,
are
which one?
criticized.
There are two.
The fake one, you say.
Fake one, okay.
So in the fake one, the icon makers are criticized for painting Christ with long hair. Yet in
Yeah.
the Panarion, he explicitly argues Christ had long hair. So
Yeah.
does this demonstrate the letter is falsely ascribed but authentic?
Well, there you go. Nicephorus brings that out very clearly, and I agree. We want to build up the case for the differences between the two bodies of literature. Now, in the Panarion, the real Epiphanius says that Jesus had long hair because he was he was fulfilling the Nazarite. The Nazarites were prefigurations of the coming of Christ. So when the Christ comes, he has long hair. Okay, so he says that. Now in these letters and these other documents, he says that the painters, Christian painters, supposedly of his time, lie. I mean, he says they are liars. Why are they liars? Because they paint the apostles and Jesus in different ways all the time, and that the apostles are painted this way and that way, and that Jesus was not painted with long hair, and that he was the same as the apostle in his looks. Well, okay. Well, did he have long hair? I mean, it's almost one of those things, one of those questions of not so. No, did he have long hair? Didn't he have long hair? It is a difference in the two bodies of literature, but I would say it's of a minor weight. It's not one of the heavy hitter arguments against authenticity.
Now it's actually, I think, because as you're correct, it requires an inference drawn about the significance of Saint Epiphanius' observation about the Nazarites, but it is a pretty crucial detail, and there's another one, which, like you said, we're building a cumulative case, right? So in isolation, it's not the strongest. But he points out an interesting part because we don't have a quote of it. He just mentions it in passing that in the fake letter of Theodosius, he mentions that the Theotokos died by the sword. Now, the Panarion expresses doubt over this. He actually says, we don't know how she died. So, and when he does give any sort of inkling of what his belief is, it sounds like he believes in a bodily assumption of the Theotokos with no indication that she died by the sword. So what is the significance of this detail? It seems like the author of the fake letter just read the prophecy of St. Simeon very literally and puts that detail in the letter. And the real St. Epiphanius is a little more circumspect on the question. I mean, what do you think of that detail that Nikephoros preserves for us?
Have you ever seen the image of the Mother of God with 7 swords in her heart?
Mm-hmm.
Or I've seen some with arrows, 7 arrows in her chest. I mean, what was she fighting with the Indians or what, or with a sword fight with the musketeers as though they got 7. I mean, that's such a corny. I don't like that. Well, there's the notion that she died. Well, like Simeon said, a sword will pierce your heart. So that got into the tradition, and it gets expressed in various ways. And apparently, Nicephorus had heard about that or read about it in some of these documents, and he makes the note that they say she died with being pierced with a sword, taking Saint Simeon a little bit too literally. I mean, we would say he was speaking poetically or symbolically, but again, that's interesting. I'll grant you that it's interesting.
It's an interesting detail also because by the 8th century, there was pretty much a universal understanding of the Theotokos' death, that it was voluntary, that it was very dignified. There was a whole Dormition tradition, lots of sources. And so it's very interesting that a forger would have picked such a detail contrary to popular Marian piety at that time. And again, it's another example of the forger channeling the past, or the original document's not of 8th century vintage. It's a very interesting detail. So you're published on the icons. I'm published on the Dormition homilies. So that's my wheelhouse. So that's something I look at and go, this is very curious. It's a curious detail.
But it's even more curious because Saint Nicephorus did not actually quote that. He just in passing notes it, but he doesn't quote it. So it's a little bit even on his part that he didn't think it was, or maybe he thought it was too crazy even to to quote, and just says in passing.
And probably impious, considering at that point the Marian piety and how the church recognized her death, how it took place. Now let's talk a little bit about the linguistic arguments. You speak of how stylistic comparisons are not sufficient to decide the question of authenticity, Consequently, we need to follow Nicephorus' advice and examine the doctrines of the two corpora, and as we've been covering quite a bit. But you make a very interesting point about, I'm going to pronounce the words wrong, apophatic and cataphatic language,
Yeah.
right? And so how does Saint Epiphanius have apophatic and cataphatic language, and how does this inveigh against some of the conceptual presumptions of Saint Epiphanius? So what is, if you could explain to us, apophatic and cataphatic language, and how is this different between the real works of Saint Epiphanius and the ones ascribed to him with the iconoclasm?
Okay. The distinction is classic, and it's fundamental to our whole, maybe not the words, but the ideas behind it. Apophatic is negative, cataphatic is positive. We can say nothing about God. Anything that we say about God is not right. It's false. It's a lie. Oh, you're not talking to me. Okay.
I was giving stage directions to my wife.
Okay. So God, in the beginning of the liturgy, we say God is incomprehensible, invisible, uncircumscribable. We have all of these negative words because we can't say anything positive about God. God is not like anything in our world. All of that is apophatic. That means negative. We can only say negative things about him in his essence, in his nature. Now, that's where this word incomprehensible comes in. When the real Saint Epiphanius talks about the incarnation, the Logos before the incarnation was incomprehensible. After the incarnation, he is comprehensible. Now, the comprehensible is cataphatic. That's positive. Now, we say a lot of things about God, don't we? We say he's the rock of my salvation. Oh, wait a minute. Is he really a rock? No. God, he's the shepherd of my soul. Is he really? Oh, wait a minute. Is he really a shepherd? No, we know he's not a shepherd, but we say he's the shepherd of my soul. That's the whole essence and energies distinction. We can say we don't know who God is, and we can't say what he is. All we can do is say what he doesn't, what he isn't. But in his action in the world, what he does, as opposed to what he is and what he does, there we can say that God is a shepherd. He acts like a shepherd, and he does shepherding things. And we can say that in his action in the world, he's that way. Well, so that distinction is fundamental. It runs all the way through the fathers, and is part of our inherited theological tradition. We in fact have to think that way, otherwise we get in trouble. So that was the point of trying to go back into Epiphanius, the real one, in the Panarion, and find out how he uses apophatic language. That means the negative language. And how he uses cataphatic, the positive language. And that particular passage, which we've talked about a couple times before, with incomprehensible, that shows the apophatic, and then the cataphatic, the positive, using describable. That's perfectly orthodox. It's great. In the other document, he uses apophatic language to talk about both the Logos before the incarnation and the Logos after the incarnation. That's bad news. All the lights go on, all the blinking starts to go, because you can't do that. And that's that distinction: apophatic, cataphatic.
Well, thank you, Father. It's
I don't know if does that help? Anyway,
it does there.
Get those two words into your vocabulary. You need that.
I don't know. I think every time I learn a word, I forget a word.
Oh.
There's no more space left.
Oh, come on.
Now, doesn't the Panarion include negative valuations of the use of images by the Caprocratians and Arabs who worshipped an image of Moses? So, could this suggest possibly that Saint Epiphanius had a little bit of a negative view about images? That is there in the Panarion.
Well, look at what does it say about the image of Moses? They made these. I forget who the people were. They made an image of Moses, and what did they do? They worshipped it. They made an idol out of it. So, are we surprised that Saint Epiphanius or anybody else would condemn such a thing? No. Okay, so that's par for the course. Again, you can't take that incident when it's very clear that they made the image and they worshipped it. You can't use that as evidence that Epiphanius was against Christian images. Now, the other one, there's the Carpocratians. They had statues of Jesus and Plato and Aristotle and all the philosophers, and they all put them together and worshipped them, and did like the pagans and worshipped them, and maybe even offered some kind of sacrifices. It's a question, and here there's a little bit of, you can make both. Did Epiphanius, and going back to Saint Irenaeus in 178, 180, when he talks about these people, were they upset by the fact that they had statues of Jesus? I mean, the very existence of a statue of Jesus, an image of Jesus, were they upset about that? Or were they, and what seems a little bit more likely, they were upset by the fact that the statue of Jesus was put in with all these other guys, and they offered sacrifices and worship these idols? That our side would tend to say, look, they were not opposed to having a statue or an image of Jesus as such. What they were opposed to is this syncretistic religious salad, put him and all the others in together, and then do some kind of a worship service, worshiping them. That's obviously out. Iconoclastic and iconophobic and the hostility, people who are believe in the hostility theory, they want to use the whole, say that Saint Irenaeus and Epiphanius and everybody else has their opinion. These are people are reacting against the very fact that there was an image, in addition to its being put into a syncretistic liturgical or situation and worship. That you can. I think we have the easier part there, but it's kind of a intellectual splitting of hairs. So you can go both ways on that.
Now, let's get to some of the works in detail. Now, there's one that has a really long title. It's like Against Images of the Lord Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary and the Saints and the Angels. It's like literally like 2-sentence long title.
Yes, it's a very long one.
And so,
you want the real thing?
Sure, if you got the title right in front of you.
The treatise of Saint Epiphanius against those who, following an idolatrous practice, make images with the intention of reproducing the likeness of Christ, the Mother of God, the angels, and the prophets.
So there you go, a nice long title. In that treatise, it cites that iconodullia is widespread. It cites bishops and doctors of the church, that he spoke to many of them and only a few listened to him.
Yeah.
And so my question to you is, why would whoever forged that have undercut his own argument so severely? So like the same thing I posed to you with Nicaea too, observing this. Why would he forge something so silly or so stupid? And why would you even pose something like that as some sort of convincing evidence? What would possess someone?
Yeah, well, we have to get in the heads of the people who wrote this. I'm assuming it's not authentic. And why would they do that? I guess to show because they're taking Epiphanius as their hero. He's our guy. Way back then he's fighting against. It's a David and Goliath thing, and they're taking poor David, who's Epiphanius, and he's against these bad guys, these bishops, and even the emperor, and they're not doing anything, and he's out there fighting the good fight. He's our guy. Let's build him up as much as possible. And maybe this is the point too. If this is the case, wow, it is evidence for our side that there were images in the churches, mosaics, and all over the place. So you do have to kind of wonder, what was in their head? It's sort of like going back to the, when was Saint Epiphanius born? He was born before Nicaea, but they say he was raised in the Nicene faith. Mm-hmm. Well, why would they make such a mistake like that? And I guess they maybe got overexcited or something. I don't know.
It's one. I think it's Bruce Metzger. I forget his. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He's a textual critic for the scriptures, and he gives sort of rules to text criticism for the scriptures and ancient documents. And he says usually when there's a rendering that is like incoherent or just kind of silly, and it's been preserved for whatever reason, that's usually a good attestation to its early origin. And so when I see some of these disparate details, like them getting his ethnicity wrong, something which would hurt the iconoclast case instead of help it. It does speak of, imagine you're the iconoclast, you got full imperial support, you're not the little guy, you are the Goliath, you're not the David, and you got all that support, but you lack patristic evidence. And so you would probably be pretty desperately digging through the ancient evidence, hoping to find something, anything, even the Acts of John, which is from a Gnostic, and say, look, the Acts of John agrees with me, even though it's Docetus, it doesn't matter. So if they found these works, even though they eviscerate their own position because their position lacks early attestation, they would have just desperately grabbed at anything. And so that kind of implies at least the early existence of the document, perhaps not the right description of the author for the reasons we mentioned, but the early existence of the document is at least by the rules of text criticism, something we'd have to take seriously, because it's kind of hard to explain why they would retain some of these self-eviscerating passages in these documents. Let me ask this question, unless you have a follow-up on that. The same letter cites Canon 35 Laodicea against the veneration of angels and opposes the veneration of angels. And so let me ask you this. Did iconoclasts reject the veneration of angelic beings? Why would they cite this canon in such a literalistic way, which would seem to go against universal piety in the 8th century?
Well, what does that canon actually say? Do you have it before you?
I don't have it before me, but it's against the worship of angels. But why would the iconoclasts use that canon? Because that's something like a Protestant would miscite, right? Why would the iconoclasts cite that canon, thinking it improves their case? Wouldn't it just alienate them from everyone that was praying to their guardian angels at that time?
Again, you're asking us to get into the heads of the iconoclasts, and ask why they would pick that as one of the weapons in their arsenal.
It's something to consider. Again, it's one of those silly details which show at least an authentically early enough origin where you could find someone making such an argument.
Well,
like
the canon,
that. It would be
the
unthinkable
canon is
in the
there
8th
and real. That's nobody questions that. The problem is, does that canon speak against the making of images of angels, or does it speak against the making of images of angels and worshiping them? That's the whole point there. And of course, from their point of view, from the iconoclast point of view, or from iconophobes' point of view in general, those two things are together. But
Now,
we think that's a misinterpretation. It's using a text that really doesn't support their position, using that as a kind of a proof text and just using it. But close analysis shows that canon, like many of the texts that we talked about the last time, in the first 3 centuries, they're talking about idolatry. They're not talking about Christian images.
and
And if
actually, that
you,
canon, to read the canon, states Christians must not forsake the church of God and go away and invoke angels and gather assemblies which are forbidden. If therefore anyone shall be found engaged in this covert idolatry, let him be anathema. For he has forsaken our Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, has gone over to idolatry. So it speaks of idolatry, but particularly assemblies worshiping angels as if they're gods. So there's
yeah,
actually no explicit mention of images in that
yeah,
canon.
yeah, yeah.
The
It's, I don't know if you see on TV or I see books and all over the place. Your guardian angel and all this. There's a real effort to promote angelology. And angels are really big things. Well, yeah, they are big things, but they're only servants of God. They're not. You're not supposed to focus on them, uh, in themselves, as this canon is showing. But
unless we're commemorating them that day, right?
well, that's a different thing. We're only commemorating them because they're servants of God, not because they're some kind of celestial being that runs around and does good things or bad things or whatever in and of themselves, but because they're servants and messengers from God.
Now, let me pose this one additional um, proof that most of the arguments posed by Eusebius in this by Saint Epiphanius in this treatise are a lot of like scripture only arguments. This is not rare from 4th century apologists like Saint Basil and on the Trinity. He makes most of his arguments from the scriptures. You get into a lot of the saints arguing a lot of these things during this era. There's a lot of polemical arguments from the scriptures. And mainly it's the Nestorian controversy where we actually start seeing a shift where they start citing patristic authorities almost as many times as they cite the scriptures. And when we get to later doctrinal disputes, they almost cite the fathers more than the scriptures as the actual disputes get more and more narrow in points of doctrine where the scriptures are this less explicit on these matters. This is something that scholars have observed. Jonathan Moss talks about this in Corruptible Bodies, that there's a real shift in how the church argues its apologetics. Now, the point is this. In a polemical work against icons, it is strange that the basis of the argument would be very fitting in a 4th century context, but not an 8th century context, because the way people argued changed. So this is another hallmark of at least authentic ascription to the 4th century. Now, let me give you an opportunity to push back. Do you feel that in the 8th century they would have been keen to try to argue like a 4th century father, or that they would have resorted to just scriptural arguments because they would have lacked patristic basis for their arguments? How do you explain just the nature of that treatise making its argumentation almost solely on the basis of scriptures?
Well, it's true that as you are, the closer you get to the apostolic times, the use of scripture, I mean, that's what they would argue on. And as time goes on and people reflect on the scriptures and elaborate various points of view and interpretations, they're in the process of creating holy tradition as time goes on. People reflecting on the scriptures, and I would say that whoever's arguing, whoever's presenting a point of view, you have to start with scripture. You have to have that scripturally based. Now, then, I mean, if you only have that, then you're sola scriptura. Okay, you can do that, but that's not our point of view. But the more you go on, the more you go in history, the more witnesses you have behind you, not only the scripture itself, but witnesses that have thought about this or that, and fought against various tendencies, and you can use those as time goes on. So I'm not quite sure, even at the fourth century, fourth century, in the Trinitarian things and Arius. I mean, I'm just pulling things out of this air here. I'd have to study. Did they not? Basil and the others, did they not quote other previous authors? That's a good question. I'd have to study that to say something. But by the 9th century, you've got even more fathers and writings to talk about, and certainly the iconophiles, that's us. We would want. I mean, that's a principle of holy tradition, that the source, of course, being the Bible, and then the river that flows out of that being holy tradition. It's 100% legitimate for us to go back and pick and see what various people said, comments on the Bible, to help promote our point of view of what is in fact an authentic and proper interpretation of the scriptures and holy tradition. It was so both. I'm sure the iconoclasts felt the necessity, and they had a whole list. They made up a list of patristic sources that supposedly agreed with them and supported their case, because that's what the iconodules did. Scripture plus patristic. So I don't know if that would be.
But it does demonstrate the way these pseudo Epiphanius works are written are very different from how the iconoclasts wrote their own works. Now let me ask this question, and this is about the letter, or the pseudo letter to Saint Theodosius. If it's a forgery, why would Epiphanius impute this position to be the majority teaching of his own time, and impute it to those in the highest echelons of the church? So why make this self-eviscerating argument?
You mean he's claiming? Say that again.
Because in the letter to Saint Theodosius,
Okay.
now I don't. Oh wait, no. The letter Saint Theodosius, he actually explains how the icons are used. Sorry, I'm getting confused. So it's getting late here. So forgive me. I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna move on to another question.
Okay.
Letter of Saint Theodosius, the fake one. If the letter is fake, why include scandalous details like fasting on Saturdays, something wholly absent in the East by the Council of Trullo, as well as something that the Panarion ascribes to the Marcionites? Right? So why this absolutely bizarre detail, if a forgery?
That's.
Let me ask a follow-up question.
I don't know why they did that.
Now, how you talk some detail about Epiphanius approving fasting on Saturday during Lent. He allows some limited fasting on Saturday during Lent. So, in the 4th century, this was something that had some tolerance in the East. There was something that existed in the West. Could you give us a little more detail about that?
Well, in the real Saint Epiphanius did provide for fasting on Saturday during Lent. Okay, so that we know. The question is, did he allow for fasting on Saturday outside of Lent? And there's the two bodies of literature. One, apparently, in the authentic Epiphanius, he only allows it in Lent, and refuses it in the rest of the year, because the Marcionites, they said fasting on the whole year on Saturday, and he was against that. That we know for sure. Now the question is, in the fake or the supposedly fake documents, does Epiphanius say to fast the whole year on Saturday? I think I think he does say that, showing again a contrast between the two bodies. Now, why they would say that, um, I don't know why they would say that, and I would my point would be, it really doesn't matter why. All we have to do, we meaning the econophils, all we have to do is show that all one, two, three, four, five, six, all along the line, there are significant doctrinal, or in this case, canonical differences between the two bodies of literature, such that you can't really say that they were written by the same man, and therefore that the supposedly the iconophobic ones, there's something wrong with them. The other guy, the real Saint Epiphanius, the authentic one, says this: A, B, C, D, E, F. These other guys say Q, P, S, L, T, U, V. They're just not the same, and that's all we have to do. We don't have to go into
it's interesting. There seems to be a lot of evidence showing that it can't be the same man, but also a lot of evidence, even from the saints, where they appear to acknowledge that this may actually be an authentic early source. So those seem to be the two things that seem to coalesce as we look at these things critically. Now let's talk about the most popular letter, the letter to Saint John II of Jerusalem. Yeah. Now, Nicephorus claims that the letter to St. John's ending is an addition from the Iconoclast. So my question is, how do we have a Latin version with slight differences, which kind of implies that it has an independent existence from the Greek that we have. So it has differences, but it's otherwise intact. So if this is a iconoclast forgery, how did the Latin tradition get this?
Well, that's part of the problem of how you describe, how do you explain, and there are various theories about how this actually happened. But what is for sure is that we have from the writings of Saint Nicephorus, we have the actual Greek text. The Greek text. We also have a Latin translation of that Greek text, or of that Greek text, and nearly all of the writings and of scholars who accept the idea that Epiphanius was an iconophobe are based on that Latin translation. Now, if you look very carefully at the Latin and the Greek, you will see, and this is why I would say it is possible that I call it the postscriptum to the letter to John of Jerusalem. Let's accept that as authentic. What does it say? What does the Greek say? The Greek says that Epiphanius went into this town and he saw a light hanging over a door, and he went in. We found out it was a church. He went in to pray, and when he went in, he saw a curtain hanging on the door. And careful, what does he say in the Greek? He says that he saw an idolatrous image of a man in a human form, and that the parishioners said that that image was either Christ or one of the apostles.
They weren't sure who it was.
the people, the parishioners, were not probably very theologically or artistically, advanced. They found a hanging that they thought, well, we'll put this up in our church. Well, Epiphanius goes in and he sees that and he tears it down. He doesn't tear it up, he tears it down and says, you should use this for poor people to be buried in. Now, the Latin translation, I wouldn't agree that it's just almost the same. It is not almost the same. What it does say, it says, the Latin says that he goes into the church, he sees this image of a man, which the people say is either Jesus or the apostles. And then it adds, which is not in the Greek at all, that it is very clear that this type of image, human images in a church, are against our religion. Oh, that's not in the Greek. The Greek text does not say that. All it says is he saw a hanging, cloth hanging with a human form, and that he said it was an idolatrous one, a human form, and the people say it was Christ or the apostle. He tore it down. Okay, that the Greek does not let us know what that actually was. So, okay, he found something idolatrous. Maybe they had a picture of Apollo or Zeus. I don't know who, but it was for him.
Yeah,
It was
it's similar to Eusebius. He had no issue with statues, but with the one in I forget the city with the hemorrhaging woman, there was something kind of off about it, perhaps, you know. And
yeah, there
so
was something that he considered that Epiphanius considered to be improper. He uses the word idolatrous in Greek. Okay, that's fine. We can live with that. We can live with that because it does not have what the Latin translation has, which is a very clear statement that it is against the Christian religion to have such human images in the church. Where did the Latin translator get that? And there's the whole controversy as to whether the Latin is a faithful translation of the Greek, or are they the same, or does it make any difference? Blah blah blah. Well, I think it makes a heck of a difference because the Latin translation introduces an iconophobic theology that images of human images in the church are idolatrous. That's not in the Greek. But many of the critiques of Epiphanius and whether these documents are true or not, or whether he was really iconophobic, are based on the Latin, not on the Greek. Huh? So that totally undercuts any criticism, any statement about Epiphanius's iconophobia. If they're using the Greek, using the Latin translation, that's out.
so clearly, the Greek iconoclasts use the same Greek passage as a proof text, but as you discuss, it's just not specific enough to prove the iconoclast contention. It doesn't forbid all images. It just has this negative observation of that particular image.
And we've seen that several times. Along that the iconoclasts would take any document, any passage that had the slightest hint of iconophobia, would take that. They've taken several and use them and interpret them in their own way. But when you look at them closely in the historical context, you see that they don't. Wait a minute, they don't support your position at all. They either just say nothing about it, or they're talking about idolatry, or they in fact support our point of view.
Now, let me ask a really important question because you seem to appear that at least the Greek fragment is very possibly authentic. Why was this not mentioned at all by the Damascene, by Hira, or Nicaea too? Why is this not come up at all until the early 9th century?
Because, well, John of Damascus, he only knew about the
will, right?
The will, and he makes a certain. He talks about a logos that was circulating, and we think that logos, that text, was the treatise, the one we have have been talking about. He didn't know about the postscriptum. He didn't know about the letter to Theodosius, and he didn't know about the dogmatic letter. He didn't know about those three. So those were apparently those circulated, or they were created, however you want to say it, after him. At least that's you can logically and reasonably assume, because he didn't mention them, he didn't know about them, and so they appeared in history after him. Nicaea and the Iconoclast after that, the Council of Sophia in 820. They knew about these, so they talk about, and even Charlemagne in East Western Europe, he knew, he had the Latin translation, the fake one or the bad one here. He had that translation, and he used that, of course, in his. He was a sort of a mild iconoclast. Um,
The
so
Franks were opportunist iconoclasts, because in Rome 769 they sign on to Iconodulia because they want Rome to be against the Byzantines, and then when Rome and the Byzantines are in the same boat, all of a sudden they're not so down with icons anymore. It's pretty interesting.
yeah, yeah. There's a whole interesting theory and explanation of. I mean, actually, they were against the Pope. The Pope at the time, all the popes at the time, accepted Nicaea as an ecumenical council. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what was old Charlemagne doing over there? And the Franks and the ones who succeed? No, no, no. We're that's a bad. We want. And wait a minute, the Pope is looking up there in France, and what are you doing? I mean, it took him about 100 years. It took the popes about 100 years before they got the Franks to shut up about Nicaea too, and accept it as an ecumenical council. That was a big struggle for them, an embarrassment, of course. Here you had the great, the protector of the Roman Church contradicting the Pope. That's not a very good idea. But anyway, in the end, they did accept it, and so on we go to the next.
Well, you contradict Charlemagne. It's not good for your health. You could wake up dead.
Well, if you're in someplace else, if you're in Viking Sweden, it's okay.
Now, let me ask you a bonus question before we take an audience question or two. What do you think of the canons of Elvira? Right, we
Yes,
have
that's
we
right.
have a canon. It pretty clearly says don't
Yeah,
put these images in the church.
yeah.
We've heard people say, well, they could have had disciplinary reasons for it or whatever. The Damascene is acknowledges that that's one way which we interpret these things. What's your view, Father?
Well, the 36th canon of the Council of Elvira in Spain, about 305, we think, about 305, definitely before Constantine. Um, and we have a problem because this canon, if I can, where is it? Yes, here it is. I'll read it to you. It's very short, and it says, it has seemed good that images should not be in churches, so that what is venerated and worshipped not be painted on the walls. Well, that's not so good for us. That's there you have, and we got to be honest with this. If we have to be intellectually honest, that's a point for the other side. That you actually have a council of bishops, and they say not to paint images on the walls. Notice, we have to analyze this now. Don't paint images on the walls, so that what we worship isn't on the walls. Okay, that seems like a really there. That's we have to explain that. Okay, so here we go. Um, and this canon plus Eusebius and Epiphanius, those are the three columns that uphold the whole hostility theory about Jews and early Christians being against not having any images and not and being against images for the second commandment. That whole theoretical structure is founded principally on Eusebius and his what I say are fake documents, on Epiphanius and his either fake or misinterpreted documents, and the Council of Elvira. Now, we've already talked about, and for us, it is a proper distinction and analysis to distinguish between disciplinary canons, which are for a particular time and thing that was done. Don't do X, whatever X is. Don't do that. Okay, and then other canons that give a theological reason why you're not supposed to do X, because of X, because of this, that, and the other. Okay. Now, if you look at this canon, it certainly says they're not supposed to paint images on the walls of the church. Now, and they say walls, so they must have meant walls. Now, would they say walls if you meant something else? So does that mean then, I mean, this is a legitimate question, does that mean that it's only on walls? And if you have images elsewhere in your home,
and if you know anything about canon law, like, people are always looking to do what it doesn't forbid. They're looking for all the loopholes. So
that's par for the course. Because if once you okay, here's the canon, and it says this. It says it's our side. It's against icons. Oh well, all right. Now you jumped in to the argumentative circle, the debate. You're ready to do battle, and so okay, it's just as good for our side as it is for theirs. And does it specifically mean just on the walls? And you could have them in chapels, in your home, in catacombs, other places, but they didn't want to have them on the walls. All right. I would assume that they said not on the walls because they didn't want them on the walls. And had they not wanted them elsewhere, they would have said that. But they didn't. Okay, so the question is why?
They didn't want people touching them.
They didn't want people touching them.
That art's expensive.
Why would they not want them touching them? That doesn't make any sense.
I'm just pulling ideas out of my head.
Okay. One good explanation was that this council was held in between two periods of persecution. So this was a peacetime, a time of when there was no more persecution, and they perhaps, I mean, if something's on the wall, it's visible to everybody, and people can invade the church and like Muslims do, or put whatever they do to desecrate the images. It could be that had happened before, and this council said, let's not do that. Let's not do that, so that nobody comes into the church and paints mustaches and horns and swastikas.
Chops their faces off. Let's have portable images.
Do bad stuff to to God. Okay, maybe, I mean, that's a legitimate thing, but we can't prove that. We can't prove it. In any case, that's what they prohibited. And we don't know why. And wouldn't that be nice if we knew why? Now,
but on the other side of the coin, the Aniconists and the Iconoclasts don't know why either.
No, they don't.
Right? So we don't know why. It's just what it says.
We're both in that problem of not knowing why. Now, let's continue our analysis. There are certain elements that tend to tip the scales, at least in my opinion, tip the scales toward a really unimportant canon. What happened to that canon after it was passed? Absolutely nothing. Nothing happened to it. Nobody. It was in the books. It was there. It was always cited, and nobody tried to hide it and get it out or scratch it out. No, it just kept. It was, as they wrote a new book, they wrote that in there, and it went on and on. And on. Even Charlemagne didn't make anything of it, and he certainly would have known it as speaking Latin. It only comes to historical light in the Reformation, when Protestants start to quote it and say, "Aha! You see, they're on our side." It was a nothing in history, and nobody tried to hide it. It just was there and wasn't important anymore. Now,
This is when it comes to Western canon law compared to Eastern canon law, every single local council held in the first 5 centuries of the church that's in the East, all of them were ecumenical canons. All of them are canonized by Trullo. In the Council of Chalcedon, they're treating those local canons as authoritative.
Yes.
But the Western canons never got that treatment. So even in Latin canon law, the Eastern canons, let's say like the canon law of Dionysius Exiguus, how do you pronounce it? All of the Eastern local canons are included. The Western canons are included too, but they're not held in equal authority in the Western tradition. So like as a case in point, in the Council of Rome 769, they made it where there can't be any imperial interference in the appointment of a pope. And then 5 years later, in Rome 774, they rescind that canon so that way the Frankish king has the ability to invest who becomes pope. And so you don't see that Eastern canon law, where literally they'll flip-flop that fast. And it's, to be honest, it's something I'm still researching. And in fact, there's some questions. I reach out to people I know that know people in the old countries to actually look into this stuff too. I don't have a good answer to it. But like Western canon law was always very fungible, or whatever that word is. But Eastern canon law wasn't. And so people hear canon and they think one thing, but they're not actually contextualizing where's this canon from. So as you point out, it was kind of like this nothing burger for all of Western history, but so are tons of Western canons. There's Western canons that permit divorce in all these different situations, but the dominant Latin practice was not to allow divorce, unlike in the East. So what good were those canons, right? So this is something that people that don't have a lot of nuance and understands how we apply canon law in both the East and the West and the differences, let alone the Protestants, because they don't have canon law, they really can't understand these things. So they cite it as evidence, which it is. It's a document that says what it says. But the weight you put on it is not as cut and dry as people think. For not only the reasons you state, it only states that images can't be on walls, and why is that specific criteria, makes you have to wonder why, but also the fact that where it comes from is something that people have to consider as well. This is something that without a broader appreciation of Western canon law and its history in the first millennium is kind of hard to really grapple with. Now,
and what it is it also witnesses, this canon witnesses to the fact that there were images on the walls. Huh? You don't say don't do X if people aren't doing X, So there were images on the walls prior to this canon at 306. We don't know how long, but for let's say 10, 20 years or whatever, there were images on the in the churches in Spain. Now, it also, if you're going to make this canon carry a theological weight, then are you saying then that there was an iconoclastic movement in Spain? And
that it's otherwise not even mentioned at all, right? We have no evidence of that.
We have no evidence of an iconoclastic controversy in Spain ever. So the treatment of this canon after the fact gives weight to the interpretation that it was in fact a discipline disciplinary canon, for some reason not to paint the walls. And then when things changed, it was no longer valid. A lot of canons.
Let me add one thing in support of what you're saying, which is we got to be careful with evidence and things in isolation. Because if we took a passing statement, I think it's in Book 7 of Augustine's Confessions about Saint Monica and how she venerates the martyrs in Milan, and Saint Ambrose is absolutely scandalized and then locks her out of the reliquary and tells her, give alms and otherwise don't go into the reliquary. So someone could read that in isolation and say Saint Ambrose opposed venerating the saints.
Yeah, yeah.
But what we find later, right, with reading other texts from Augustine and Saint Ambrose, is that of course they venerated the saints and angels. By the way, Saint Ambrose has a passage where he literally talks about prayers to angels. It's the issue was the orthopraxy. He didn't like how it was being done. He didn't like that African custom. So the point is, yes, we have this canon in Spain that says don't put them on the walls, but what you don't understand is what was the orthopraxy that they expected and why did they consider that heteropraxy, right? They say not to do it. Yeah. And so that's why we got to be so careful to take these texts in isolation. Doesn't mean you don't want to, the young people, Father, they call it cope. Doesn't mean we want to dismiss it out of hand. We got to give all evidence the weight it deserves. Yeah. But we have to look at this evidence contextually with other things from the same century, what other saints write, what other ecclesiastical writers write, what the archaeological evidence dictates, and we look at these things as a historical whole. That's what a historian ought to be doing, not with a very narrow agenda, or at least, like you said, Father, you're coming from an ecclesiastical perspective, so at least be transparent about this, which I think a lot of people aren't. So we're running out of time, so we're going to do a few audience questions. We're going to try to keep answers 30 words or less so we can get as many as possible in. Like zip it, right? And so this one I'll do quick. My first question is, can you make Friday night stream regularly? I'll be going to Cambodia soon in about a month. And so things will be kind of irregular. I'll be doing even streams from there. I'm going to try to get my wife to eat bugs when she's there and videotape it for you guys. That's par for the course there. So we'll try to do some fun stuff in Cambodia, but it's the regular Friday night thing might be a little dicey for a while. Father Stephen, do you have any thoughts on the difference between post-iconoclast Western iconography in a stylistic sense? So this may be our next show on how Western art changes before and after the schism. Yeah, so could he give people a 30-word teaser?
I say, it's another book, you can get it on Smashwords, that Romanesque art, the Western, right before Gothic, is the last Western art of an iconic character. Once you get into Gothic and then Renaissance and all that other stuff, you're way off from what I claim that there is a common artistic theological tradition, east, west, north, south, that we continue to live on, and that the Western Europe, once you get into after the year 1000 into the scholastic time, not only does the theology go off the patristic track, the art
does
goes off the patristic track, and you can see it. And that's what I wrote.
It's interesting. Schism happens. Indulgences instantly appear. Art instantly deteriorates. It's a lot of weird stuff happens very fast.
A lot of things happen that at that particular time. It's also should I say this?
I blame Vikings. Vikings just had different artistic tastes.
It's about the year 1000 that the first Frankish popes become pope. Frankish popes, the ones,
the Hildebrandians. Yep.
Not the Roman ones, and a lot of things change, and of course, schism.
30 words or less. What do we make of the Dura Europos Church? that had a lot of images outside the actual worship area, but was bare inside the area of the altar. So what say you, Father?
Well, there was no chapel. There was no church with an altar. They only had a living space. It had a large living space, which was not exclusively liturgical. So they would live there, and then when it came time after dinner or whatever, they would set up something that was in the living space. The only space specifically liturgically dedicated was the chapel where the baptistry was. There they had images. They did not have images in the living room. Huh? So it was not a church and a baptistry. It was a baptistry and a living room, which they used as a church from time. It was a house church, after all.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, but the art does exist in liturgical space, in the Baptist, in the baptistry area. Yeah. So it's like, that's not really true. So it's like, it's one of those things that are exaggerated, but it doesn't mean it's without any precedent. My personal opinion is, especially in the earlier church history where there were more martyrs per churches because the religion was smaller and there were a lot of martyrs up to that point in history. You don't need all this religious art when you literally have, like, I'm just going to say, there's St. Thecla's body right there, right? Like that, that's what the center of everything's going to be. When I was in Rome and went to an ante-Nicene church, I have a whole story about it, but the point being is right front and center in the altar would have been where you put the skull of the saint that was there. And so when you have, let's say, more relics and higher quality, more intact than what we have now, like, we have tiny little bone fragments.
More genuine.
Right? And so when you have more intact relics, it kind of encourages, well, why not bring the attention towards the relic? It's an aesthetic decision, really, right? It's sort of like if your church has, I don't know, the Kursk root icon, you kind of put that in the middle. Like when it visited Jordanville 2 weeks ago. And so front and center is where they put the icon because they wanted your attention towards the celebrity icon that was there. You know what I mean? So a lot of people don't think of the aesthetics of some of these things. They just go, well, if it's not there, then it's got to mean X, Y, Z. But yet, right next, in the room next door, there is all this art and liturgical space. So people aren't very consistent with this stuff. So, Father, it was really great having you on. Let me give you another opportunity to plug your work, to say anything you find important. Any last words?
Well, plug. Go to Google and put in Smash Words. One word, Smash Words. That's the platform, the e-book platform. That'll come up, and then you put in my name, and all the books are there.
Is it guaranteed to convert Protestants?
Well, I can't guarantee anything. I mean, they're just there. Read them and do what you want with them. And I allow the buyer to set the price from $1 million down to $0. And so far, some people have paid. That's thank you very much. It helps.
But not $1 million. We're looking for who wants to be a millionaire here.
So they're there, and I put on some new videos, slideshows on academia.edu.
Great page you have there.
About death, how you show death in icons, and what are the various arguments of the iconoclasts and our answers from Nicaea II, French and English. You could go there and check those out too. Those are free. Everything's free. I mean, we don't get rich doing this.
No, that's you don't need to be. You live in Montreal, so you don't need. You already live somewhere awesome. What more do you need?
Yeah, well, I do agree with that. Such a smart fellow you are, you got one up.
Please check out Father Steven's work. It's very valuable. In some respects, I think that he has really upped the game of scholarship in this area, and And truly great work is not just insightful, it's accessible. Father Stephen's very easy to follow. He's a very approachable human being, as we could tell. We can't make his head too big. But you're the Eddie Van Halen of scholarship. You ready why?
What's that?
Eddie Van Halen?
Who's that?
You don't know Eddie Van Halen? He was the guitarist of Van Halen.
Eddie Van Allen.
Van Halen.
Van Halen.
Van Halen.
Van Halen.
Yeah.
Is that a musician?
Yeah. May he rest in peace. The point is, people argue over who's the greatest.
Is he related to Beethoven?
No.
Oh.
But the point is, people argue over who the greatest guitarist is, but it's not just the guitarist that can do all funky things in the guitar. It's the guy who can do funky things in the guitar, but also make very popular songs that people want to listen to, right?
Oh.
They have hooks, so you can listen to it, you can understand it. And I think your work is very accessible, which makes it very valuable. And it's only accessible intellectually. I mean, go get it for free online. So it's very accessible that way. Now, it's that being said, because Father Stephen isn't taking your money, I will take your money at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, provided you want to support evangelism in Cambodia. So think about it this way. You could find some nameless Orthodox apologist who doesn't even care that you exist, or some nameless Roman Catholic apologist or whomever, and help improve their kitchen with your hard-earned money, right? You put money in Patreon, you put money in YouTube, and they're going to build a nicer kitchen. Good for you. You just paid for their kitchen. Or you could build a mansion in heaven by giving alms to the Church of Cambodia, helping build up the churches there. It's we've had a lot of great donors today. I released some images of the repairs that are being performed to the cathedral in Phnom Penh, thanks to generous sponsors, particularly one extremely generous sponsor that gave a very large sum of money. And the fact of the matter is, all of us are in this together, whether it's $1, whether it's $5, whether it's 10, 100, even considerably more. It's about building up the Church of Christ, spreading the Orthodox Christian faith. I'm not connected to everywhere. My connection's Cambodia through my wife. And so if this has blessed you, I ask that you please bless the churches of Cambodia. You can go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. It's below. No one else has brought the content for years now on Iconodulia that this channel has. No one else has brought on the esteemed guest, Father Stephen. Found him, right? And so if this has blessed you, either give him a ton of money on Smashwords, or if you could afford it, please support the Church of Cambodia. If it's not just about money, please pray for the parishes there. Please pray for other donors. Also, please pray. We're trying to get a subscribe star brought up because we might have found a way to directly send money to the actual account there without any middleman in the United States. That would save a lot of time and will also allow givers to pretty much give regularly without, taking it upon, the big 3 minutes to take it upon themselves to give every month, which some of you guys do and which I greatly appreciate. And so please pray that that will go smoothly, because it will greatly improve the whole financial situation and save up time so I could focus on all this stuff than being the treasurer of these churches. So prayers are appreciated, and any financial gifts to orthodoxchristiantheology.com, of course, /donate are very appreciated. But who's also appreciated, again, Father Stephen, thank you so much for coming on tonight. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure, too. Bye-bye.
So on that note, I end the show as end all of them by quoting Jesus Sirach, fight to the death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.
Amen.